Greetings all, Dr. Garrett here along with Dr. Harbison.
Hello.
And the movement for this month is going to be, you guessed it, the push-up. So how we're going to be breaking this down is giving you guys the purpose, the setup, the execution, and the common faults, both from Dr. H's perspective and mine. So for me, the push-up, its primary function, and I'll leave some on the table here for Dr. Harbison as well, but the primary purpose for me is that this is a great upper body horizontal push that can be done anytime, any place, anywhere, with load, without load, and in all kinds of different volumes. So that is the primary purpose of a push-up for me. How about you, Dr. H?
Yeah, I 100% agree. The only thing I would add to what I see as the value or purpose of the push-up, maybe if we differ from something like the bench press, is that we can kind of get into both glenohumeral and scapular motion with the push-up. When we do this correctly, we see those two, I don't know if you want to call the scapulohumeral joint a true joint, but we see movement together versus a lot of times when we have more of a, let's say the bench press, for example, the scapula tend to be more pinned, where we can see more freedom and more motion here in this movement, which mimics a lot of real world activities. You think of like a punch or throwing a ball, the scapula moves with the humerus. And so that's one of the purposes I see of the push-up that has some value there.
Awesome. And one last thing too is the muscular endurance component. This is a great conditioning tool for the upper body in terms of expanding capacity here. We're able to get a lot of volume because it's not overloaded by an external weight like something, for example, something like a bench press. So we're not going to necessarily develop absolute strength here like we would with a bench press, but we can certainly develop strength as we build capacity to do more reps here. But it ultimately is a upper body muscular endurance tool. So that's the primary purpose for us here. As far as the setup, we're going to use this video here to help navigate through this. You're going to see a neutral spine from the crown of the head out through the heels of the foot. So it's a straight line, and we can probably argue that there is some curvature somewhere, but in general, we're looking for a plank position or as straight of a line possible from the crown of the head out through the feet. Also, our hands are just outside shoulder width, but underneath the shoulders is in terms of proximity. And if you could see the mouse, the cursor here, it's going to be my hands are directly underneath the shoulders. Our elbows are extended. And then again, we have a neutral spine down through the heels. Is there anything else for you to add there for the setup, Dr. H?
I think that's spot on for the setup there. We want to keep it simple. I think so. Neutral spine and kind of stacked elbows over the wrist throughout the movement. Those are kind of the main things I would look at as well. So I think you're right on the money there.
Awesome. Now, in terms of execution, from just inferior to our shoulder girdle and down, it remains the same. So that means that our spine, our hips, our femurs, our tib fib, those all stay the same. There's no movement in the lower half. This movement is focused primarily and solely at the elbow and the shoulder joints, as we previously discussed. So for execution, we're just going to be descending, and I'll show a rep or 5 reps here. So we're going to descend and ascend. We're going down and up, down and up. And I'm going to stop here in the down position. What you're going to notice is that the forearm is more or less vertical. And in the longer form version of this video, we'll go ahead and talk about some variations to that. But you're going to notice that there's still a neutral position all the way throughout the body. The shoulders are extending and the elbows are flexing. And we're reaching a full range of motion. The chest is on the floor, the stomach and the thighs. And you'll notice that they're all generally touching at the same exact time. It's not thighs first and then chest or vice versa. Everything is moving in as one unit. All right, so we're returned back into our starting position. Do you have anything for execution here, Dr. H?
Go ahead and drop back down to the bottom of the movement there, if you could. So I mentioned previously the idea of a stacked elbow. This is a perfect example of the elbow. If you look from from this angle, the elbow is directly over the wrist joint. If we were to shift the camera so that we were looking kind of from basically a superior to inferior view, looking at your head, we'd want to see similarly, oh, hey, beautiful, that the elbows look, especially you can see this perfectly on your left elbow, so the viewer's right, the elbow is still directly over the wrist. It's not, the elbows aren't medial or lateral to the wrist. That's a very common error that I'll see is elbows tracking incorrectly as a result of typically also the shoulder joint. So you have to kind of match the degree of glenohumeral abduction to hand position. So we can alter one or both of those to fit kind of where we want the elbows to be, but regardless of hand position, so the closer the hands are, the more adduction we need to have, kind of getting the humerus here. The wider the hands are, the more abduction we'll have to get that neutral or stacked elbow over the wrist position.
Mm-hmm. And that I think will flow into our common faults. So do you want to jump into those, and specifically as far as elbow position and what that's like anatomically? Is that internal rotation, external rotation? Are we abducting to get there, but then as we execute, it's more of an internal and external rotation movement? Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, so for me, when we talk common faults with the push-up, the two areas that are, I think, the most susceptible to fault would be the trunk and the shoulder. And those would be the ones we want to be the most careful with in this movement. So at the shoulder joint, as you mentioned, if we are abducted all the way to 90 and we're dropping down at the eccentric movement, there's a little bit of internal rotation at the shoulder, not a lot, but there is some. And if you look at what the actual test for shoulder impingement is, it is abduction with internal rotation,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the empty can test. So you're putting yourself into an impinged position by doing that. So we don't want a 90-degree abducted shoulder in any type of push-up or bench press type movement. Closer to that 45, maybe upwards of 60-ish kind of degrees of abduction at the shoulder joint would be kind of that happy medium. So that's the main thing I'd be looking for at the shoulder, is to make sure that we're not cranked up all the way up here. You can do, so there's certainly some variations where you're doing a close grip press, but for the standard push-up, right around 45 to maybe 60 degrees of abduction. Again, making sure that the elbow is stacked over the wrist. So basically determining hand position based on how much abduction or adduction you want.
Yeah, and then I'll follow up and finish this up with the trunk position. So if we're going to, from this area here during the descent, during the way down, let's get a couple reps back. So on the way down, if we see that the hips are moving before the shoulder, remember, this is a upper body dominant movement. The lower half is not involved here. So if we're starting to overextend our spine and our hips drop, that is another common fault, where the knees, thighs, or hips will meet the floor before the chest. And then lastly, remember, we want a neutral spine, as mentioned, and how we can also break that is through our cervical spine, where we'll start to reach down with our neck and kind of chicken peck, as some will refer to. But these are the common faults, and we'll also be going on and expanding upon some of this in our next video. But we wanted to give you a quick version of our purpose, setup, execution, and common faults. Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everybody.